Hey everyone, welcome back to the Holy Comforter Episcopal Church YouTube Bible Study. I'm Jimmy Abbott, and I have some thoughts and reflections for you about the gospel lesson for this upcoming Sunday, February 9th, which is Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. I want to make sure I got that right. We'll be picking up right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, we didn't hear the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount last week because it was the feast of the presentation of our Lord Jesus Christ. So we're we're picking up halfway through. Now, one thing to remember about the Gospel of Matthew is that Matthew casts Jesus as a new Moses. I mean, think of just the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus climbs a mountain to give a new law, the pinnacle of his teaching. It should just, all these alarm bells should be going off in our mind about Moses climbing the mountain to receive the commandments from God. And so that's how Matthew portrays this and sets this up. Now, we should acknowledge that the Sermon on the Mount has some very difficult teaching. Now, the stuff for this Sunday is stuff that we know very well. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. We hear all of that, and that's okay. Some of the tougher stuff will come later about anger, about adultery, about divorce, about retaliation. And so this is also what I want to do today is kind of set us up and get us ready for the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, one of the interesting things that Stanley Hauerwas talks about in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew is that both conservative Christians and progressive Christians agree on one thing about the Sermon on the Mount, and that is that the Sermon on the Mount has to be conformed to living in the actual real world. The disagreements just happen to be about how that conformity takes place. And Hauerwas just acknowledges that there's something off there, that we really then need to think about what is actually going on, not only in our own lives, but in our Christian communities. Part of what Hauerwas is talking about is that the Sermon on the Mount, the way of life that Jesus describes, this is not something that we aspire to. We should not go off and aspire to mourn. We should not go off and aspire to be meek, as Jesus talks about in the Beatitudes. We should not go off and try to get somebody to slap us on one cheek so that we can offer the other one also. Rather, I think Jesus is saying that is a description of how you will live once you have chosen to follow in the ways of the Lord. And second, Hauerwas says, that type of following and that type of life is only possible when it's grounded in Christian community. That it's only in community that this type of life is possible, the type of life that Jesus describes in the Sermon on the Mount. So when he talks about the salt of the earth, the light of the world, he's not talking about you as an individual in front of your YouTube screen right now. He's talking about you as a community, as the followers of Jesus. You corporately are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. And so that means that we have to live together to be that sign and that symbol to the rest of the world. I know this is tough, and especially in a very individualistic society like ours, where so much of what we want from church is what we get out of it, and we're more than happy to pick up stakes and move on to another church once that congregation doesn't suit our needs. But I think what Jesus is calling us back to remember is that we have to first live in community. And it is only living by and through community that we can actually really fulfill the Sermon on the Mount. So I want you to think about your own Christian community, be it Holy Comforter or somewhere else. How can you engage more deeply? How can you be more committed in the life of your congregation? And how can then that be a sign to the rest of the world of what it means to be salt and light? So there's a lot to unpack there, and there will be more to unpack as we go through the Sermon on the Mount. I just want to encourage you to keep reading it and to wrestle with it, understanding full well that it is a difficult text, but this really is the pinnacle of Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of Matthew, and that's really how Matthew sets it up as the new Moses, the new law, the new way of living. So thank you all so much for joining me. Of course, I'd love to hear from you with any comments or questions that you may have.